Thank you for listening to Life Improvement Radio. You are listening to a rebroadcast of a previously recorded show.
And Richard, you are on the line, so I'm excited to welcome to the program author, poet Richard Blanco. Richard, how are you?
Hi, Neil. Good to be here.
Good to chat with you again, Richard. I was giving a little bit of a summary for our listeners, but you probably could summarize your amazing whirlwind with involving the inauguration and all those things in a certain way, and then we'll get right into your latest stuff.
Sure. I mean, it's coming up almost on a 4-year anniversary. Obviously, it's been an amazing journey since then. Just doing readings and lectures and workshops throughout the country. But more importantly, I've just felt I've been invited to sort of places that are not the usual suspects, like the FDIC and the Mayo Clinic and places like that. So I'm really thrilled to be able to put poetry out there to people that might not otherwise have access to it or think about having a poet as a keynote. So that's been the real exciting part, is just sort of evangelizing poetry in a way that keeps me going, because I feel like a country music singer these days on a bus somewhere to a poetry reading, but it's all wonderful.
Exactly, Richard. And just by you being chosen by President Obama to do this, it's changed your career. You were successful as a poet, as I remember before, with your book and everything, but somehow to be picked for that opportunity, you've taken this platform and rolled with it, haven't you?
Yes, and additionally, and maybe now it's becoming even more important to me. But additionally, it also changed my way of writing and my approach to poetry, in the sense of being a more civic-minded poet, a poet that sort of can speak to current events, can speak to other issues that are sort of out, that are sort of. I was sort of clinging to my autobiographical crutch a little bit, and ever since the inauguration, being in that public space and realizing how poetry can occupy public space, and the idea of poetry as a means for public discourse, as a means of to create public or political or social conscience. So my whole sort of sense of writing and my sort of purpose of what a poem can do or should do in the world has also changed, and that's been wonderful as well. It's a new discovery for me.
Okay, Peter, question for Richard.
Yeah, so it's awesome to hear about your accomplishments, the places you've been. My question would be, is getting into those, awesome situations and being able to showcase your work in that way. How do you deal with, because there's got to be an immense pressure of some kind. I mean, you might probably be already familiar with it and be able to handle it a little bit better than you used to, but how is that, or how do you handle it in those situations? Because I bet it's both very stressful, but also very, honoring and a very awesome moment.
Yeah, I mean, I spend about 70% of my time on the road still to this day. I always think that things will slow down, and then they don't. But again, it's sort of having a sense of purpose, a sense of a message, a sense of turning people on to poetry. And we all know how many people have, this panic mode, this panic button about poetry. So that keeps me going because it's so rewarding. And I also think that, in a sense, poetry is just so much about, the sense of being the village voice, the sense of it is sort of like music in that way, that it's part of a communal act. It sort of, brings people together as a proverbial village around the proverbial campfire. And I get a lot out of it. I mean, I think I consider the poem done when it's shared, and I get that sort of feedback loop of energy. And so that keeps me going. I'm not saying it's easy, but it does keep me going. And I have managed to write 2.5 books on the road too, because that also keeps me balanced. Coming back to the writing is very important to remember that. So you're writing out of hotel rooms and hotel lobbies and airplanes, but that also sort of keeps me balanced and sort of keeps the rudder in the water.
Gotcha. Just one more thing, kind of piggybacking off of that. When you are preparing for an event or showing or reading or whatever it might be for your works, what goes into prepping, not only for the sake of when you go to the initial event, but also for when you create your works?
Sure. Again, that's changed a little bit in the last few years. These are being more sort of a civic conscious, a civic-minded poet, but also writing, about a dozen occasional poems or commissioned poems. So that process has changed a little bit, but it's always about thinking about, in some ways, where do my sentiments or my emotional centers lie in relation to my audience. In the case of an occasional poem, you actually have a real tangible audience, like, let's say, a poem I did for freedomtomarry.org. So that was obviously something that was very specific in audience, but it was about connecting my emotional lifeline to that of my perceived or actual audience. So that has changed a little bit, and a lot of the prep has to do with getting to that space. Some of the other poems, which involve actually sometimes hours and hours of research. I'm working on a book right now called Boundaries, which deals with psychological, racial, socioeconomic boundaries or whatnot. Sometimes, like a poem I just wrote for Angel Island, which is like the Ellis Island of the West Coast for much of Chinese American immigration. And going into that world and researching it for hours and finding stories, not just facts, but stories, real human stories behind these historical moments or historical places. So it's really exciting because it's just a whole new way for me to enter a poem, and and that's just the nature of writing, right? If you can't keep on challenging yourself, if you get bored with your own process, you always got to shake it up a little bit. So I'm grateful that inadvertently and unwittingly my life journey, my life path has led me to sort of come to poetry in this way. And I feel it's still my story and my voice, but I just feel like I've learned how to tell that story or play that story on a different instrument, so to speak.
Gotcha. And I understand completely about, being as ambitious as possible, challenging yourself at every corner, because it's something I love to do. Because one of my motto is perseverance is your key to the impossible. And I believe that people can achieve the impossible. They keep challenging themselves and they keep going through the daily lives and challenging themselves either in their art or their work or whatever it might be. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
And challenging the world. I mean, I think now, as we know, as a country, we're pretty divided, and I think there's a great place for poetry and the arts in general to serve as a conduit or as a catalyst to have conversations that I think we need to have, right? So, there's that part too. You feel like you're doing something in the world that's worthy.
Got it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
You'd mentioned a couple of your commissioned pieces. Do you feel like some of the larger works you've done, maybe for the president or various other instances, have just brought more awareness to poetry overall? By doing that.
Yeah, certainly, because again, it also reaches the unusual suspects. It demystifies poetry for people. It gives them a connection point where some people have usually they're turned off by poetry in high school and figure that was the last thing that was ever written, right? And they say, oh, I don't get poetry, but the fact is that usually they've just never picked up a poem ever since. So it's not that you don't get it; it's just most people have not had the opportunity to connect with it. So yeah, because it's always around an event, and it always is sort of making it's an interesting combination or intersection often between politics, poetry, and pop. And that I just love that. I mean, and that also gets back to the DNA, of course, of poetry as, again, the village voice, as song, as music. It's no wonder that Bob Dylan sort of won the Nobel Prize, and I think that they were paying tribute to that sense of what poetry, what the song and what poetry can do in the world in terms of connecting people. So yeah, that's a big part of it.
That's awesome.
You know what I've noticed, Richard, is you've definitely evolved since the first time I talked to you at the Bible Book Fair. Your evolution as an activist and a writer, and you're really looking at more than poetry now in your career, aren't you? In certain ways.
Yeah. Again, I feel like I've been, the feeling that sometimes in life you're pushing and sometimes you're being pulled, and the latter being the better feeling. So I feel like I've been being pulled in a good way towards this other dimension of my work, and again, I'm so grateful for it. And trying to again put poetry out there, and not just for the sake of poetry, but for the sake of what it can do in the world. We just had speaking about occasional poems. I'm also sort of not just occasional poems, but thinking about current events as something that becomes an occasion to write for, even if nobody asked me to. So we just had a poem called Election Year that was published in the Boston Globe the Sunday before the election. And my hope was in that poem to sort of let us think about what our democracy is. It was somewhat of an apolitical poem, but thinking about something beyond just the frenzy of before the election. So yeah, just trying to put poetry in places that people can access it, poetry that comes inspired, not just, I call it, it's sort of evolved, I think, from the poetry of I to the poetry of we. And that's not to say that the autobiographical is very powerful, or that I don't include the autobiographical in these more public poems. But yeah, that's definitely where I'm at right now. It's an exciting place.
Well, that's great. Where's the best place we can find information on you, Richard, and learn more about you? Where can we go?
Oh, sure, great. Website is pretty cool. www.richard-blanco.com. And of course, Facebook, and those are the two main places. And that I'll have all the publications and news and things that are going on, and schedule of events.
And because our nation's so divided, Richard, we need to be able to, even though the discourse has been so negative on both areas and fighting and stuff, we need to recover very quickly.
Yeah.
Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that poetry and the arts in general offer us a way out, so to speak, because they scratch below the surface and really get to the emotional complexities of what's at hand, and I think offer us other dimensions of things that we don't always think about, and I certainly think that's why art survives. Art is really all of art is really the true emotional historians. They're the ones that really tell the whole story of civilization, and it's what survives mostly.
Right.
It's what really gives a record of the humanity of our humanity.
Exactly. Well, Richard, best of luck. I believe that's the key, and I think everyone needs to kind of focus on the holidays, focus on time with their loved ones, and forget about what's happened. Not forget, but let it go and recover and move forward in 2017. That's what we have to look at.
Yeah, and dig a little deeper and see how can I personally make something happen, amends. How can we start talking to each other in a way that we haven't been talking to each other for a few decades now? That's
Exactly.
the most important thing.
Exactly.
Right,
you're doing it, Richard. Well, thanks for calling, man, and take care.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
All right, bye-bye. You're listening to Authors Corner, powered by Life Improvement Radio, live from the Mind Book Fair. We'll be back in just a moment.
Thank you for listening to Life Improvement Radio. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own and shall not be construed in any way as advice from Life Improvement Radio. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our website. Personal perspectives expressed by the producers, writers, or editors will always be presented as such. Any rebroadcast or retransmission without the expressed written consent of Life Improvement Radio is strictly prohibited. Thanks for listening.